feedback and marking. I'm sure everyone's familiar with this, Sutton Trust Toolkit, etc. The things that are at the top here in terms of costs, so cheaper basically goes down here, and in terms of impact, so basically you want to be up here largely. And the thing that comes out at the top there, a series of meta-analysis, is always feedback and metacognition. And that came quite clearly through with the secondary heads as well, particularly around the notion of feedback and marking. And there's an aspect of here in terms of workload as well. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play, I don't know if you've seen these, but on the EF website, there are a series of toolkit talks. Is everyone familiar with the toolkit talks? Yeah.
So according to the toolkit, effective feedback can add an extra 9 months in development over 1 year for children. Why does it have such a huge impact on attainment?
I think there are a couple of points here. One is that the research suggests that that's the potential gain that's achievable. The research also suggests that it's actually quite hard to do well. I think why it's so effective is feedback is what helps a learner change what they were going to do. So it encourages them to focus their effort in a different place, or to attend to specific areas of maths or literacy that they're learning, and helps them home in on what they can best do to improve.
But what is it specifically about feedback that makes it effective?
Well, the evidence suggests that it needs to be specific. So giving pupils examples of what it is they need to do to improve at a fairly detailed level in terms of their work. That it's even better if that's referenced to something they were doing before that they're now doing better, so you're showing them what they're improving. It should be given reasonably sparingly so that it's meaningful, so that you're not always telling pupils what they've got to do, but you kind of home in on what will make the most difference to encourage them. It should also support them in attributing their improvement to effort rather than to ability, so that they're aware that they need to focus and work hard on bringing about improvement.
To me, there are loads of nuggets buried in some of the things that Steve said there. So is everyone familiar with the notion of 3 or 2 stars and a wish, for example? So that was developed by Steve with some teachers down in Cornwall a few years back. And when I first started importing that idea, I changed it. So I changed it from 3 stars and a wish to 2 stars and a wish, because I thought, well, it's just 2 things. It's not the thing we want to work on. But actually, if you remember what Steve said there, he said that actually feedback works best when we give feedback about the things that, the positive things that the pupils are doing, not necessarily the negative things. And it's actually very easy in terms of feedback just to focus on what you perceive to be next steps, isn't it? That actually what you want to do differently, what you're not doing well at this stage is this. But actually, if we give feedback on the things that pupils are doing well, then actually it has a greater effect than the things that they're doing less well. So actually having 3 stars was actually more important than 2 stars. So I immediately started changing the research, and it was important to have those 3 things in there because there was a certain conceptual understanding of the pupils, and they could actually take the feedback and understand the feedback a little bit more. So can you see that actually sometimes it's working on the things where sometimes we might go into a classroom and teachers are very much focused on the do this, do that, you haven't done this, as opposed to you've done this well, you've done this well, and that's where the focus could be. So in terms of how effective that can be, I've already talked about the idea of the meta-analysis. It says that, it suggests that the feedback can have an impact of +8 months. Feedback has an impact of learning across all groups and all ages and all subjects, and is linked to assessment for learning, and one evaluation indicated an impact of half the GCSE grade per student is achievable by putting effective feedback in. How secure is the evidence? There are a substantial number of reviews. The most recent meta-analysis on formative assessment was more modest. Has anyone heard of the study in 2015 in the schools in Durham on Hattie's paper? Is people familiar with this? There was, so 2015, there were, I think it was 13 schools in the Durham area. They were given the power of feedback. It's Hattie and Tipperley's seminal paper. And they were given time to analyse the paper and to disseminate it across their schools over a period of a year. After that year, Durham University came in and did an assessment and did a comparison with 45 control schools that didn't have the intervention. So they've had a year of working on effective feedback. What do you think the impact was? Any ideas? 0. It had no impact. So you've taken the thing that says that's supposed to be at the top there, you've disseminated it across schools and it had no impact. I don't want to put you off at this point because I will come back to the positive aspects of it. But one of the things that Steve said right at the beginning was this is quite difficult to do. So it's something that needs to be done, but it does have to be done because we do it all the time, don't we? Every single moment, all those interactions are about feedback. But it's a complicated thing to do. The research suggests it's done best when there is sufficient professional development. So that's one of the things. Just sitting there and doing this by yourself is not really an option. It has to be around professional development. So, for example, there are two models here. I've mentioned Hattie already, but also Wiliam, other people like Shirley Clark, etc. And they came up with various models which look at how feedback can be effective. So I've mentioned this paper already, The Power of Feedback. So Hattie distills this into where am I going, how am I going, and where to next. It sounds quite simple, doesn't it, in some respects? I remember listening to Hattie talking at this YouTube video of him talking to mathematics teachers at a conference in Australia. And one of the things that he said about feedback, that when he realised the power of feedback, was when he stopped thinking about feedback being a process of from the teacher to the pupil, and he started thinking about actually the most critical part of that feedback is from the pupil back to the teacher. And so a lot of this can be about diagnosis, about diagnostics, about how we use diagnostics to make sure that our teaching is contingent on that diagnostic information and making sure that feedback loop is completed and secure, and it's not just about me to you. So Hattie has, I think hopefully what this is going to do is to give you an impression of the kind of things that we could look at in terms of the research. So he talks about the 4 processes: task, process, self-regulation and self. And Steve alluded to some of those things. So for example, self is about just giving praise for something that was really good, which is just useless, isn't it? I can remember doing work scrutinies many years ago where it's just good at the bottom, and what use is that to anybody? It's just completely ineffective feedback. And there are various models that we can work for to look at, for example, the feed up, which is the question of where I'm going, the feedback, where am I going to, and then the feed forward, the next step in terms of feedback. Again, Hattie as well says the same thing. The research is clear. Feedback is more effective when it provides information on correct rather than incorrect responses. I mentioned this to my teachers the other day as I was putting these slides together, and they were going, oh yeah, we must stop doing that. We must stop saying, do this differently, etc., and start praising for it, but being quite specific for those things. Impact is influenced by difficulty of goals and tasks. It's the most impact when goals are specific and challenging, but task complexity is low. So again, there's a juggling act here in terms of the type of feedback that we're given, and we know about praise as being ineffective. And this is an interesting one as well. Hattie sees the job of the teacher is to make work as difficult as possible. And I suppose part of this is talking about the fundamental difference between performance and learning. And it fits quite nicely into that, the TA you're going to tell me often, Vanessa, not the pyramid, the triangle, the questioning triangle with the prompting, etc. Because what a lot of teachers do when you're observing them is they heighten performance by giving too much feedback. It's like sat-nav learning, isn't it? Go here, go here, go here. You've arrived at the destination, but you've not thought on the way, and you can't describe the journey that you've been on. That heightens performance, but we know in terms of the way the mind works, in terms of the way the brain works, it doesn't heighten learning. It puts you up there for the moment, but then later on, 1 week, 2 weeks later, that learning is not there. And that's reflected as well. I'll come back in a second to what Bjork says on desirable difficulties. I'll move on to that in a second. So Wiliam feedback, he talks about sharing criteria with learners and self-assessment. So feedback's not just about teacher to the pupil or even pupil back to the teacher. It's about those metacognitive aspects as well in terms of learning. And the fascination that I've got with Bjork's idea, Bjork's notion of desirable difficulties. Again, making the learning as hard as possible, which makes the learning in the moment difficult, but it makes learning over a longer period of time durable. So these are really kind of fascinating aspects of learning in terms of the feedback that we can give. And the notion of immediate and delayed feedback as well. Wiliam says that, frankly, there's been an argument, what's better, delayed feedback or immediate feedback? Well, they serve 2 different functions, but fundamentally, feedback doesn't matter unless people do things differently, unless the who's receiving the feedback does something differently. So, but sometimes there's this complexity around immediate feedback. Feedback is given too immediately and too frequently can lead learners to be overly dependent on it. as an aid during practice. So we're especially talking maybe SEN children, for example, will become dependent on that feedback. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't give pupils feedback, but it means that we should be judiciously withholding and delaying feedback. Again, what we do during part of this project is to actually kind of discuss what that means and what the implications are in terms of practice. And just top 10 tips about feedback. Address faulty interpretations, not total lack of understanding. If it's total lack of understanding following diagnosis, then it's direct instructions. And then that can move into Rosenshine's principles of instruction, which we can look at as well. More impact from telling pupils what they got right. Comments, not grades, which I think everyone's quite familiar with. Prompts, etc. Suitably challenging. Giving sparingly in terms of the feedback. Timely, and we'll look at that, the delayed and immediate feedback. Specific, and task and process, and not on self. So I hope that gives you a bit of a whistle-top tour of kind of the things that we would examine over the course of the year in terms of, there's a rich literature out there, but interpreting that is difficult, it's complex, and measuring the impact is going to be difficult. So one of the things that we're proposing to do as well is a series of potential micro-trials across schools, where we'll look at certain questions. So for example, does marking matter? And what we might do is a trial across schools where we're working together with you to say, over a period of 3 weeks, we won't do any marking in books and we'll just use it as verbal feedback. Does it make any difference? And it'd be really interesting that we can tease this notion out. Does it make a difference? I think Michael Tidd recently in his blog said that he's pretty much convinced, certainly at a primary level, that the 99% of marking is just absolutely useless. Then why are we expecting our teachers to spend all their time doing it? It's just utterly ridiculous, isn't it? So just to cover this aspect of it, I'm sure most of you are familiar with a marks improvement. It was an Oxford University and EEF publication around marking, and the conclusion was, challenge me on this if I'm wrong, the conclusion roughly was we don't know what works. Is that about summarise it? And they're now putting £2 million into projects to try and find out what does work. And I think that's really important, personally, in terms of workload, etc. You know, there's no point doing all this work if it's having no impact, frankly, is there? So, but we'll look at that. So we're in touch with James Richardson, who was one of the co-authors, etc. of that, and Velda down in Oxford as well.